for Urban History in Lviv. And together with my fellow co-organizer, Kim Brian Dudek from Pochen Biennale in Chemnitz, we have organized this event. We have organized this discussion about the relations between the topic of Anthropocene and the current Russian war against Ukraine, and the effect that this war, this invasion, and accompanying weaponization of nuclear power or fossil fuel power generation destruction, and the other damage to the overall environment in Ukraine has also this extraterritorial effect on the world and broader than simply Ukraine, but also how that relates to also collective responsibility and solidarity, and what arts and humanities can actually say about this relation, and how it can actually also challenge this future uncertainties of the Anthropocene and in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. And we have excellent speakers for this event and for this discussion today. Together with us today is Ася Bastareva, who is an art historian whose research spans visual culture and environmental humanities. She's currently a research fellow at the Faculty of Media at the Bauhaus University of Weimar and an associate member of the Critical Media Lab in Basel. Her research interest focuses on hybrid European Soviet modernity and its ideological and material implications in spaces, bodies, and lands. We also have today Michel Saub, who's an artist, researcher, instrumentalist, filmmaker, and coder. He has been a professor at HFG ZKM in Germany and is the founding director of the Oasis Archive of the European Union. He's the co-founder of the Open Home Project, a humanitarian initiative helping people affected by the Fukushima nuclear crisis in Japan. His ongoing research, called The Archaeology of Future, focuses on the underlying forces of nature and society. We also have today Alexander Klose, who is a cultural theorist, curator, and concept developer. His work focuses on the interplay between technologies of communication and transport and processes of social reformation. Together with Benjamin Steininger, Alexander Klose has been developing the research project called Beauty of Oil, Understanding Petromodernity. And we also have another speaker from across the Atlantics today with us, Sofia Anastasievsky, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Government at Harvard University. Sofia specializes in moral, political, and legal philosophy and works primarily on topics in the ethics of war. She has secondary research interests in the moral and legal dimensions of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. Sofia also holds a BA in philosophy from the University of Chicago and an MA in bioethics from New York University. And this discussion today will be moderated by my colleague Bogdan Shumilovich, who is a researcher at the Center for Urban History and an associate professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. His main areas of work are media history in East Central Europe and Soviet Union, media arts, visual studies, urban spatial practices, and urban creativity. And before I will give a mic to Bogdan, I also want to give an opportunity for short intro remarks to my fellow co-organizer, Kim Brian Dudek from Pochen. So, Kim, please, have word.
Yeah, thank you, Taras. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guests and, of course, to our listeners. My name is Kim Brian Dudek. I'm the director or project manager of the Pochen Biennale. And yeah, I'm really looking forward for the discussion, for the exchange of ideas and the different perspectives. And I'm really curious what you're gonna tell in this topic. Maybe some words about the framework of the event and maybe the starting point of our collaboration between Center for Urban History and the Pochen Biennale. In 3 weeks, Pochen Biennale with the title Ex Oriente Ignis, The Fire Comes from the East, will open in Chemnitz here in Germany. And the Pochen Biennale has 3 pillars: media art exhibition, youth exhibition, and the discourse program. And this event is part, I would say, of the discourse program. And thanks to our curator, Serge Klimko, we have this powerful and meaningful title and the concept behind it. And it harks back to the term or phrase, ex oriente lux, the light comes from the east, which was a phrase of the Enlightenment. And this is maybe the first connection to the whole collaboration. It was also used in the 1920s by the Ukraine writer, and I hope I give my best to pronounce it right. For me, it's really difficult. Mikhalo Krivilovi, in a poem of the same name. And in this poem, Krivilovi transforms the light into smoke to the ex oriente lux to ex oriente fumis, and this starts to describe the changing landscape through the industrialization of Donbass. And moreover, it connects the changing environment to change economy and, of course, social behaviors. And our title now, Ex Oriente Ignis, refers more to the moments of the revelation, the elements of renewable, but also, of course, to the brutal reality nowadays. And we see it every day now for now, I think 920 days, when we see the destroying of cities and ecosystems, and see that, consuming resources and attributing new meanings to oil, gas, electricity, and also daylight and darkness. And what becomes clear from my point of view, both in the announcement of the event and in our biennial, is that fire, or we have to talk about the fire situation and the power of fire to unite and also to divide, and that we may be aware of something what should like internal matters are actually represents a collective responsibility in the present and of course in the future. So I'm really looking forward. I'm really pleased that we're having this event, and thanks to the Center for Urban History and Taras to organize this event and concept it. So I'm really looking forward, and hand over to Bodan.
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Bohdan, and I'm very happy to facilitate this discussion. And I greet all our visitors who will come later, actually, during the festival without any comments, those who will see us on YouTube, and those who come here in this live discussion. And before we proceed, I will just explain how we will work. So we will have one round of directed questions and then answers from our participants, and then we will have more free discussion, and then at the end we will have also Q&A session from the audience. So be aware that we give possibilities also for you to ask questions and participate in discussion. And I'd like to start with my summer trip to Vienna. I see one of the professors here, Harchenko Artem, with whom I visited Vienna. We were invited to the Central European University, which recently opened the hub to study Anthropocene. And this hub for Anthropocene at Central European University, which shifted from Budapest to Vienna due to unfavorable political situation in Hungary, as you probably know. And this hub is interested to publish a book on war and Anthropocene. And together with Artem, we will write a chapter on urbicide of the city of Kharkiv, city which is constantly demolished and bombarded by Russian army without any actually military interest, just to destroy the city. And then the development of my city, the city of Lviv, which gains a lot through the war, because there are a lot of people who shift to my city, and we have a lot of industries which were relocated from the east to the west. And while being on this seminar, I realized that most of the participants, they are not interested in art and culture. They are mainly political scholars, like historians, sociologists. They study oil, they study Anthropocene, they study kind of natural resources. But they are not really engaged in arts. But I like art, so I went to Secession, this famous museum, not the museum, but rather gallery in Vienna. And there was an exhibition just by coincidence. It was called Testing Grounds. And this exhibition, I will just read a particle from the blurb of this exhibition. Testing Grounds was connected to the recent excavation in the Karlsplatz in the center of Vienna of the nuclear elements. Yes, they excavated actually some elements that got into Karlsplatz from the nuclear tests that were happening all over the globe in various places. And the text said something like this. This was installation by Catherine Horneck and some other artists. And the text says as follows. With her artistic oeuvre and curatorial practice, Catherine Horneck playfully engages with the strange paradoxes of living in the age of the Anthropocene. That is the new geological epoch where the effects of, and then she enumerates, capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism are written into the body of the earth. And the participants of the seminar where I was in the summer of this year, they also used a lot of wordings like metaphors or definitions similar to aggressive petrostate, resourcification, and so on. And my first question is to Alexander Klose, who is a cultural theorist, but also he calls himself a concept developer. And Alexander is known for making this atlas of petromodernity, and he's promoting the idea of petromodernity, which is a bit different from all those ideas of petrostate or aggressive petrostate. And I would like you, Alexander, to elaborate a bit on this concept and maybe some other concepts which are connected to it, please.
Hello, can you hear me properly? Yeah, good. Thanks, Bogdan, and thanks to the organizers of this talk. It's going to be very interesting, I think. The concept of petromodernity as a critical research concept is maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 years old, and starts from the assumption that during roughly the last 100 years, both the energy flows, but also the materialities coming from petroleum and also gas, of course, have profoundly shaped the industrial civilization we're in, to an extent that even the digital age or also the nuclear age actually on their base are, so to say, resting on those technologies and materialities of petroleum. So in order to try to understand the time we are living in and how it was shaped, it seems to be very important to see how deeply our civilization in all different layers and aspects is kind of rooted in those technologies and possibilities also, and promises, and also ideologies that are linked, and of course also politics that are linked to petroleum. And the political situation we are facing now, after the sort of second and even more severe and total outbreak of the war in the Ukraine, is differing quite significantly from the situation when and mainly American and Canadian and then more and more international research communities started to research into this petromodernity, because in a way it seemed like the age of petroleum is still in full-fledged, but it's obviously ending. And in order to, so to say, properly get out of it and really and understand all the entanglements, it is necessary as kind of an enlightenment procedure almost to go back and try to understand it. But with this war, it seems that a lot of the core elements of this age are actually all again there, completely there, or have never gone away. I mean, this is probably also going to be one topic in the talk today. And one more thing I want to state in regard of the term petromodernity compared to Anthropocene. Our research, research of Benjamin Steininger, whom you mentioned in the friendly introduction, and me, and when we founded the research collective Beauty of Oil, that was actually quite shortly after the Paris Climate Conference, and it was on the assumption that we don't know how long it will take and if it will be fast enough, but we are on this train now towards a different, more ecologically grounded form of civilization. And so we are facing the end of petromodernity. At the same time, there were all these discussions about the term Anthropocene in terms of where it puts the responsibilities, that it claims that it's human-made and then it's all humanity and so on. And so historically, it has been a very important political term, no doubt about that. But we are convinced that the term petromodernity is actually much more precise regarding who is responsible for it and also who should be made responsible for it, for most of the misery, so to say, or the problems we are facing today. So because it directly points its finger to the materiality, the most important materialities that are at the core of the cultural evolutionary development of the last 100 years, whereas the other term kind of, then it's clear, okay, it all started with fire and then it started with settlement and so on. It goes way back, and it's important to think about that, but it's also clear that the great acceleration of the 20th century has done most of the things whose results we are now facing. So that's just this is why we propose to study petromodernities instead of study the Anthropocene.
Yeah, scholars in many places, in different locations, they study the influence of natural resources, or sometimes they call it like these staples, on societies, on cultures. We are aware that often social systems are constructed under the influence of natural resources. Some scholars call this the curse of natural resources, and very much it is connected to petroleum. And one scholar of Russian origin, he said that Putin is actually against, but he says, modernity. So he uses petroleum against modernity. How would you comment on this? Because like in your term, he cannot be against petromodernity because his tool of being against modernity is petroleum. He wants, using petroleum, get back to the orthodoxy, whatever, traditional conservative cultures, empires, old loved by him empires and colonialism. What would you say on this?
Well, I mean, I think maybe it's helpful to go with Latour there, and we have never been modern. I mean, there are different concepts of modernity in this discourse, I would say. And quite clearly, at least in his last years, Latour was somehow also anti-modern in a way. It's like we need to leave modernity, but then there's also this contradiction, and at the same time said that we have never actually got really modern. And this modernity, of course, was about plurality of views, critical distances, and so on and so forth. So kind of a post-modernity, maybe more. We have been using another concept, which was initially coined by Stéphanie Le Ménager, energy humanities scholar from the United States, who was very important in the formation of these critical petromodernity studies. he invented the term petromelancholia, and with that, she basically tried to describe mainly all those kind of reactionary elements of U.S. American petroculture, starting in the late 1970s, when it was obvious that the time of easy oil, where it was, just like gushing out and was everywhere, was over, and it was becoming increasingly more expensive in terms of really money, but also that you couldn't oversee anymore the ecological price and so on. So a lot of the phenomena of the last decades, which seem to be very counterintuitive, like even bigger cars, though we know that actually we should drive smaller cars, even more car driving, even though we know that we should, and so on. Keep airplane flights, all these things, she called them, but also all the spectacular culture she called petromelancholic. And in a way, I would say that both Trump and Putin are. It sounds a bit cynical if you look at their, so to say, the impact of these political figures, but still, in a way, they are, so to say, full-fledged petromelancholical characters in this interpretation. So they are petromodern, but of course, petromodernity itself has to end. And all their political destiny, in a way, is tied to a prolonging of this era, and then reinvention of this kind of geopolitics. And saving those markets, making sure that oil is still produced and used in as large amounts as possible, plus gas, of course, and especially in the case of Russia.
Yeah, indeed, there are a lot of voices who say that actually Putin's war on Ukraine is kind of war on this green turn that was going to happen in Europe. And now it's less likely will happen. This green turn is jeopardized by this war, and in many countries they are less willing to kind of restrain from some energies like atomic energies in favor of some kind of naturally or based on more not that extractive but more kind of generative, yes, resources like wind or energy, but we will not go into this direction. I'd like to pose the question for our participant from more artistic side, Michel. So we always are puzzled since Romanticism whether art actually can influence politics. Is it possible at all? I mean, you do a lot of artistic works, and in your film, Trinity Twins, yes, you have a beautiful description of the nuclear experiments in Germany, and then this Trinity was used as a probably metaphor also for the experiments in New Mexico by the Americans. And you use another metaphor. So we heard about petromelancholy, petromodernity, Anthropocene, and you use the metaphor of atom sphere. And when you use this metaphor, you are just stating the actual situation, or you also want to change something? Do you believe that actually artistic practices can help to change?
To answer, thank you for inviting me and for the question. I would like to straight answer your question with yes, I do think that art can change the course of things. What I want to say here is that I'm not talking about art in the terms of a profession and a system where you make a living, but as a means of understanding and transporting an old language that's mostly been forgotten or neglected. Let me explain. Especially in the nuclear age, let's call it nuclear age, there are a lot of connotations I see that you are from a Catholic university. It will be obvious to you that Ra is a god, Dio is a god, Marie is a god, Kyrie is a god, Trinity is a multi-god, that it's really interesting to see which language this is based on, what is unfolding. I'm not trying now to get this in an esoteric level because we're facing wars and real threats. I also want to add that the anticipated uncertainty is for me an anticipated certainty. I'm certain that we're in a way to evolve the atmosphere. And so in order to affect that, and I'm not going to say I was a big help in changing the world or anything. I think it's really hard to do it. But if you do, it's the only chance is to be outside of any circles, may they be industrial or academic or otherwise. You must really activate this language, this underlying language, in order to change it. Changes will be not understood by anybody, but you can see effects. Could I give you an example? Yes, I could. But let me explain a bit more. A lot of these things I'm expressing myself came to me as being miraculous. Like I am born in Hechingen, which actually happened to be the headquarter of the German uranium project at the end of World War II. Why was it there? Berlin was bombed in 1944, and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is, let's say, the MIT of Germany at the time, or the KIT of Germany at the time, has to be evacuated. So the Nobel Prize winners like Otto Hahn, who actually discovered nuclear fission together with Lise Meitner, which brings you to Vienna, they had to be evacuated. And where would be the best place? That would be in south of Germany, because it's forgotten, really forgotten. There is a lot of hiding places, and Winston Churchill called these places the evil places in the south. So I could actually study the beginnings of what is now unfolding from a very close look, because it was happening in my family's buildings, and it was actually happening in my friend's family's buildings. What is going on there is a very strange moment in time, where Albert Einstein also comes to this village because he's in love with Else Einstein, his cousin. And also after that, Werner Heisenberg and all these other Nobel Prize winners, what they actually come up with is a non-functional uranium reactor. But it is the reason why the Manhattan Project actually had been started. And I'm sure you heard lately Mr. Trump saying that now is a good time to start a new Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence. I thought that to be remarkable, because all these things, and I want to elaborate later, are in a line of nuclear development and nuclear language. Just think about how much of our current technology is based actually on military things, like the internet itself come from ARPANET. And this year, on November 16, will be the 50th anniversary of the Arecibo interstellar radio message, which actually is just a folkloric tale. The Arecibo telescope was in its first use, was there to detect whether incoming missiles in the ionosphere carried a nuclear warhead or not. So you see right there that the development of a technology has a reason, a very heavy reason, may it be military or not, often gets handed to civil use, but of course has all the implications that are caused by its military past and big brother, so to say, its military family. To sum up, yes, I would say it is very possible to directly not only expose developments, but also to change the course of things with art.
I have another question. The nuclear technology and the physics of these microelements is often considered to be very special. Like, you know, in Ukraine, when Chernobyl disaster happened, many people were really they envisage this unheimlich, you know, Freudian unheimlich,
Yeah.
since you cannot really see what kills you. You know, the radiation is invisible. You can only detect it with special devices. There is famous history of the Ukrainian film maker Vladimir Shevchenko, who was actually recording the Chernobyl disaster from the helicopter, and then he
Yeah.
died. He died
Yeah.
of the huge radiation that he was exposed to, and his camera was buried underground because it was very much dangerous. So do you work with this idea visible, invisible? It's very kind of old, especially in German tradition, like the idea of Bildung and Bild and something that you can see, something you cannot see. In this regard, it's very difficult actually if it's not visual, visible, if you cannot turn it into the concept, how to influence people, you know, with art. How do you implement this in your art?
That's a very strong question, because if you take the nuclear as a topic, it's very hard to finance this. It's almost impossible. The second, if you take then the invisible, it's even more impossible. I must say that Chernobyl has been one of these places that are essential. I know that everybody would make a pilgrimage to Taj Mahal or other places, energy places, etc. I think Chernobyl is this place, and it actually completely changed my whole view on Earth when I was there in 2008. So as you enter, it looks like an installation. There's police, there is red, white stripes. It's the narratives of an exclusion zone, etc., etc. And then you start asking the policeman there whether his kids maybe need money for school books, because you want to go in, and she says, yes, I need money for my kids' school books, but I have to tell you that the soldiers that come in 30 kilometers or in 10 kilometers, they have no children. So what I want to say is, once you've been inside this place and see it unfold and actually start to feel it, and that's the first discovery I made, that some people obviously are able to feel nuclear radiation. They do not oppose the idea that animals can feel it, because one saying is, maybe a myth or not, that a lot of animals came actually running and out of this zone. But human can too. I met a lot of people who have been filming down these places, or been to these places, or had political reasons to be in these places, or actually made their military service in Chernobyl, and they all said that they could anticipate this energy, may it be unpleasant or not. And I myself, I could feel it a lot, because I was even addicted to it for 2 years. What is radiation addiction actually exists. And I understand that this may be a disease not yet known, radiation addictness, but I see it also in how politicians deal with it. It has the same spirit. Like this, the Russian iconography is very strong. Like, we chained the atom. There's all these chains there, and who the chains are for, actually. So the invisible, how to deal with that in art is, for instance, I give you a quick example. We made a network for environmental data, which actually dust. Dust is also invisible, and actually dust in the terms of particulate matter can carry radioactivity. So when I ask myself, what can you actually really do to help this change, this place, it is to address the next generations, because what is invisible for me will be the reality for the next generation. This is my understanding, and I am trying to prepare the following generations for terms like radioactivity, particulate matter, the slow microscopic apocalypse, if you wish, like this, because I cannot talk to their parents because they really neglect it. It's much easier now, but 10 years ago, you know, people were constantly shouting at you. You were like, what are you, like a eco-Marxist or whatever, you know, depending on where you go, or this. It was, so to say, a horrible experience, not as horrible as what you experience right now, but that's the way to deal with the invisible, to introduce it as the next real thing.
Thank you, Michel. I'd like to move on and to ask some questions to Asha. I mentioned this Anthropocene hub at Central European University, and they, in their description, they talk about implosion of the Anthropocene. It's interestingly that, so we have so many metaphors, like, you know, the implosion of Anthropocene, the development or atlas of modernity, petromelancholy, and we will follow with terms, because Asya also uses terms and definitions and concepts which helps her to convey important ideas. One of the idea is that Ukraine, which now faces the brutal war in Europe, is kind of was conceptualized as a substance without the substance. Yes, so she's talking about Ukraine as a territory, and this metaphor of the breadbasket of Europe, which I heard in the United States when I was studying there. Also, students were talking, "Oh, Ukraine, yes, breadbasket of Europe." And I also was amazed, like in the 90s, that, you know, people know you not because of some other people, but they know you since you are from the kind of resourceful country which gives something to others. Yes, and then Asya talks about this resourcification, and then different colonial powers that actually caused this war. So I want you, Asya, to deliberate a bit and tell us more about these ideas of the resourcification and colonial powers, and then also about the war, how this war, art, and Anthropocene, in your understanding, correlate.
Thank you, Bogdan. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. So I will approach the question of resourcification from afar, in a sense, and I would like to first think about something that is so obvious, including the rhetorics of the Anthropocene that became very popular. You just mentioned the implosion, right, of the Anthropocene. And Anthropocene, in a sense, became such an obvious framework in the past years. And also, what is interesting, if we look at the past 2 years, that it is kind of obvious now for people, or at least it presents itself as something obvious, that this war is very much related to energy and fossil fuels, right? And so for me, this something that is now presented as so obvious, for me, this is where we can actually find the problem, because for whatever reasons, this obvious was not seen for a very long period of time, right? And even if it was somehow on the radar, there was still no language about how to talk about it. So suddenly the war, the big war that started in 2022, And the conversations around energy, and for those who live in Europe, you see energy absolutely everywhere, in every newspaper, on billboard, and in the rhetorics, in the conversations about Russian gas and the amount of money that it generates. So somehow it's obvious, but it's still not clear what this obvious means and how to talk about it, and what's relationship of this obvious to the Anthropocene. And so for me, I think for many years it was also a methodological question in many ways, right? How do we first, why, how is it possible that the conversations around the Anthropocene or petromodernities, and then the broader framework of environmental humanities in the West, how somehow it is not capable of understanding how to include in this linear history of European Western modernity and capitalism, what is the relationship of this narrative to places like Ukraine? And moreover, this was not even a question methodologically. And so for me, the starting point was to understand why on one hand, there is so much conversation about the nature and the humans, and whatever humans have done to the earth, and how else we can talk about the earth to give it more agency, and so on and so on. While at the same time, this language kind of lacking, right? Understanding or providing certain methodological cues to how we can tackle places like Ukraine or Syria or Palestine, and what are the places, how we can locate these places within this big narrative of environmental humanities. And I think this brings me to also kind of a understanding also that even with concepts such as petramodernity, so these concepts are also part and parcel of the epistemic frameworks that they're addressing, in a sense, right? Because the narrative of petramodernity, again, is situated within this lineage of Western developments of Western scientific thought that was seemingly neutral, but then also paralleled with this production of concept of nature, and then the extraction from nature, and then kind of coming back to understanding like how to historicize, producing media to understand how this whole process can be historicized and recorded and known. So where can we see, or like why, my question was, right, why, what kind of filter or what kind of epistemic biases prevents us, like different us, not very specific us, but let's say us in Western academia to begin with, from seeing this relationship between, let's say, what is happening to you in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, in many other places. So what prevents us, what obfuscates the current multiple violences that happen there? And so with this question in mind, also, some years ago, I started thinking about this relationship or between the narrative of Anthropocene or bigger narratives or problems posed by environmental humanities in relation to places like Ukraine, which has a very complicated history, right? And we know that it is both very much influenced and exploited by Western modernity, but then also Russian and then Soviet modernity. So it is a place at the intersection of this very different, or somewhat similar modernities, but with very different speeds and different kind of limits and limitlessness of how they approached bodies and lands. But to understand how we even talk about the environment in a very extended sense in Ukraine, and by environment, we are not only meaning this division between nature and culture, very much questioned, but also this very complex entanglement of modernities, but then also different regimes, kind of in different histories that it had produced. And so with this brings me back to resourcification that you asked about, because I was trying to understand what kind of working method or framework for the analysis I could use to understand this complex let's say, history of environment in Ukraine. And with that in mind, I think the post-colonial conversation was very limiting for me, because again, it's often very much linked to the question of identity in relation to the history of nation states. So I was interested in figuring out a material method of understanding of these processes, and this is how I was looking at how the knowledge about the place, or how it is being produced through certain imaginations and imaginaries. And through production of such imaginaries, it is made into a certain resource that is out there for someone else's use. And so what I've written in the past is precisely how the construction of this image of Ukraine as a territory that is full of resources was happening over the past few centuries, and it's still very much produced and reproduced in Europe in the context of current ideas of how to treat Ukraine in the war and after the war, and what kind of resources are there, even in this very difficult time, and even when Ukraine is under existential threat. So I think this is kind of a intro point, and I'm happy to elaborate further.
Yeah, thank you. You define resourcification as operational space merely a site for material transactions. So you say that resourcification takes away any agency, yes, of locals. Like, you know, this is just Ukraine turns to become just the territory, the resource, something that you can take, extract, you use, you engage with, but in a technical, you know, sense. And we still have, like when it comes to, because you in one of your texts you described like Ukraine was colonized by Russia and then Western powers, but mainly behind Western powers stays Poland with its first wave of colonization of what is now Ukrainian lands. And this colonization was motivated by this grain development. Yeah, so there was a huge demand in European kingdoms. The population was growing, and the kingdoms were expanding outside. So the grain was needed for the fleet, for many other purposes. And the Polish kingdom was expanding to the east, actually making these lands lived spaces. And, you know, in Polish historiography, they never used the idea of that they were colonizing these spaces. So I have a colleague in Warsaw, and she says that recently she was fired for continuously saying that Polish mission was colonial, because in Poland, they normally call it misja cywilizacyjna. This was civilizing mission. So that they brought actually civilization to these kind of East, beastie, quiet, whatever lands in the East. And this is my long question to the simple issue. Do you think, since you are involved in humanities and arts, if it's possible to kind of fight with such strong metaphors like, you know, misja cywilizacyjna, breadbasket, whatever territory, Ukraine as a territory, with all these kind of prefixes, the Ukraine, Ukraine, на Ukraine, в Ukraine, and all this stuff that we are now fighting continuously, are there possibilities to kind of deconstruct, or maybe to construct something else? What is your take on this?
Yeah, thank you, Bogdan. I think what you just mentioned is more kind of a historical account of the history between Ukraine and Poland. What I'm interested in is in looking at how certain imaginaries are produced and what kind of actions they further enable. And so resourcification in this sense is understood as a very complex mixture of different social processes through which something is rendered as a resource, right? And it can be like, again, like some scientific inquiries, it can be some political, technopolitical decisions that are then introduced and normalized through various ways. And in my work, I also use the term socio-technical imaginaries, which comes from science and technology studies, which I think is very productive. because science and technology studies is this kind of collective set of beliefs that are produced and then normalized to have some sort of public consent, right? And I look at, for example, sustainability as an example of such socio-technical imaginaries, because for like the, I don't know, 30-something year now, starting from 1987, right, the idea of sustainable, green, and so on is being used for projects that are really, they might be sustainable for certain places, but then they produce enormous unsustainability elsewhere. And this is what we see in this energy relationship between Germany and Ukraine, where transition to like better, greener gas in Germany, right, led to further existential threat to Ukraine, because the calls to suspend Nord Stream 2 and so on, and to address it somehow were completely ignored. So what I'm interested in, how these imaginaries are produced. And so you asked if it's possible to deconstruct. I think absolutely yes. And I think this is what we are doing. And if we are looking at also even the past 3 decades, how much more vocabulary and language we have to understand the kind of processes that produce and reproduce multiple fast and slow violences. So my question is rather not only about whether it's possible to deconstruct. It is possible, but the question is also where we are looking and why. And this brings me back to my initial comment, because I feel like this big invasion of Ukraine was such a shock for academia and arts, because it was like an eruption of something that has no name into a very convenient established narrative of the critique of Western modernity and so on and so on. But then suddenly there is something else that also has a voice, right? And then also kind of proposes a certain critique, I think, towards the frameworks of Western environmental humanities, in a sense that, like, I think a lot of theory that is currently produced in Western environmental humanities is very crucial and essential, yet there is still a huge epistemic gap in terms of what is the role, not only in of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, but then also what if we understand Russia or Soviet Union not as a monolith identity, right? But really a lot of processes of which some of them have names, but these names are just not seen somehow. Some of them still need to figure out the way, how do we talk about it methodologically, and how this becomes part of the agenda of environmental humanities. Because often, it is often the case, speaking of, again, whether we can deconstruct, I think I still, every few months, I attend some event here in Europe where the basic counter imaginary to the evil capitalist West is drawn from, like, it's still somewhere in the Soviet avant-garde or Soviet thought or Soviet understanding of the planetary or Soviet understanding of the noosphere, and so on and so on. So I think the de-romanticization and bringing more political and historical specificity to the concepts that are often used is very important.
Thank you, Asa. And I have a question to our another participant, Sophia, and I'd like to start with the quote from Asa, actually, from one of your texts, and it is related to Ukraine during the war, and I quote, "What kind of life will be possible here afterward? Our cities are in ruins, our fields are mined, our water is poisoned, metal falls from the sky and explodes and explodes. Our air is filled with smoke from burning oil deposits. After all is said and done, will this territory will be conceptualized as Chernobyl, as completely wasted, so that at some point it can be creatively repurposed for a different, greener, nonsensical future." The end of quote. And in this citation from you, Asya, I feel like this irony and also this irony about also European politics, about the inability and this possibility of which gives the possibility to destroy something, often using what Sophia frames as nuclear coercion. Yes, so not only Sophia, but many scholars use this idea of nuclear coercion. But for instance, what happened with Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine can be easily compared to tactical nuclear, explosion. It was really huge disaster, and it didn't really cause politicians to support Ukraine on the level that it can win this war. No, nothing has happened. The Kakhovka Dam was not bombed as a, so it's not nuclear bomb, but it's by the causal effect is very similar. Yes. And my question to Sophia is about this another metaphor that we will use today, this nuclear coercion. How it is possible that the metaphor, this idea, the concept of nuclear bombing is so powerful that it influences the ethics of war, the ethics of democracy, actually the mere possibility of democracy to function. And you wrote about this and you think about this also epistemic impossibility of acting on behalf of Ukraine, but also the need to do this, this ethical. Please elaborate on this.
Sure, thank you so much. And I want to thank the organizers of this event and my fellow panelists too. So I think about this a lot, and I think nuclear weapons are both a real weapon and a metaphor. And we're seeing that play out in Ukraine. In terms of nuclear threats as a weapon, I think what we see is just like the weaponization of fear, but then also the use of actual nuclear energy stations as weapons, like, the threat posed by the Kakhovka Dam destruction would have caused a power plant to be a nuclear weapon. So you're seeing things sort of being repurposed for these military uses. As far as how that sort of creates a problem for what to do about it, basically, the way I see nuclear coercion working is it weaponizes people's biggest fears of like total apocalypse, right? And I think because we have seen, well, nuclear weapons are relatively new. We've only seen their use a few times. Every time there is a nuclear either weapon use or explosion, it's disastrous, has far-reaching consequences. So this really just preys upon our worst fears of the end of the world. But I think my own sort of controversial view is that it's unlikely that we would see that level of nuclear use if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon. And instead, what we're actually seeing is nuclear weapons conceptually being deployed to provide cover for grave human rights abuses and just the total destruction of Ukraine. So it's like, is what's happening in Ukraine right now actually worse than what would happen if a tactical nuclear weapon was used? I don't actually know the answer to that. I think people are concerned of the breaking of like a nuclear taboo with respect to nuclear weapons use, but I think, maybe we should have a taboo against genocide that's equally strong, for example, or if you're using nuclear coercion as a weapon, is the nuclear taboo even really working? So it's sort of like, what does the concept of nuclear weapons allow you to do in a negative sense? Like, what kind of destruction does it enable? And then what would, so I basically I don't know exactly what the answer is in terms of what to do with respect to nuclear coercion and nuclear weapons. I think this is a really complicated problem that involves balancing like near-term dangers against future dangers, weighing different kinds of ethical considerations. So I like see the central moral problem of the war in Ukraine as how to balance nuclear risk against what, you know, I would describe and many experts would describe as an ongoing genocide. Like we don't want to create a precedent in international society that you can make nuclear threats and carry out a genocide that incentivizes, and territorial aggression that just incentivizes other nations to develop nuclear weapons and then use them to, you know, to terrorize their neighbors or others. So I think if we don't, I mean, I think it's very crucial to develop a response to this that allows us to preserve human rights and territorial integrity, because if we don't, then I think we're liable to see this again and again and again. But again, that's like a near term versus future term thing. So it's like in the near term, maybe fighting for Ukraine's territorial integrity and peace, like a just peace, not just peace. That might increase nuclear risks like on a sort of like local level on a time scale. But then if we don't do it, I think global nuclear threats rise overall. So, I mean, it's a complicated problem. Oh, and I guess I also wanted to, well, I want to comment on something a little bit adjacent to this topic, but that I was thinking about in terms of the way environmental destruction is wrought in this war, and again in the concept of in the context of genocide. So for those who are like if anyone here is unconvinced this is a genocide, I would refer you to there's a blog called Just Security. They're collecting a list of Russian eliminationist rhetoric against Ukrainians. So if you haven't looked at that, or you need to persuade someone this is a genocidal war, I would recommend looking at that resource. So genocide aims to destroy a population in whole or in part. And that's happening in a number of ways in Ukraine. Obviously, we see it whenever a city is deoccupied or a village is deoccupied, we see the mass graves. We see the attacks on Ukrainian language use. We see people in temporarily occupied territories being killed for expressing their ethnic identity. You know, we see genocidal war rape that seeks to destroy people's spirit as well as targeting like reproductive aspects of war. But I think actually destruction of an environment is another way in which you can further a genocide, right? So if you want to destroy a people, destroying their land and making it inhabitable makes it such that they can't live there and they can't create their own life. And if we see, and if it's specifically an attack on an ethnicity, ethnicities are generally tied to land. So, you know, you disrupt it completely. And I mean, we see that. We see people fleeing Ukraine. There's really big demographic problems. You know, many women leave, many men die. Like it's effective, and creating an uninhabitable environment will make it very difficult for people to come back and rebuild. And again, and another sense in which this is genocidal is actually more like historical looking. Like for Ukrainians, like the Ukrainians are an agrarian people. And so an attack on their ability to like create, their ability to practice like what is a traditional form of life is another specific attack on them as an ethnic group. And I actually think it kind of harkens back to the way, different mode obviously, but like the Holodomor was also an attack on people's like natural and traditional ways of being. So I think we're just seeing sort of like a repetition with a twist, but with different technologies involved, it's obviously like the scale and the depth of things is much greater. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like you to elaborate a bit more also on this crimes against nature. So we have these following genocide, as you mentioned, we have all these new wordings like, you know, after Balkan Wars, this new term of urbicide became very common, and now we have this term ecocide. Do you think like these crimes against nature, which are, as you vividly describe, are very effective in Ukraine? Russians destroy Ukrainian land, nature. They destroyed state-protected territories. I mean, resorts, natural resorts in Kherson region, in the south of Ukraine. They invaded Chernobyl special zone. they destroyed in Kharkiv region certain places where they have some oil, so burning, destroying basically lands on earth. And do you think such crimes against I don't say nature, but like because we don't have a representative for nature, like following Latourian imagination, we need to have some representation for nature, for the rivers, for the land. But do you think this can change the situation, that some international tribunal will be formed to prosecute such crimes, or this may foster the development of these representative powers, political representative powers for natural forms?
I think this can be a useful framework for understanding some of the particular kinds of harms that are happening. As you sort of pointed to, there's a challenge in describing certain things as ecocide or herbicide because they aren't human, and typically we think of harms being as against individuals or against collective groups of humans. I think there have this is not really my area, but I think there have been some moves to sort of anthropomorphize environmental features, and so you can have like a river bringing a lawsuit against someone or something for damage. I don't personally think that's I don't think anthropomorphizing natural resources is particularly effective or accurate. But, and this is actually a big debate in bioethics, like, is the environment valuable in itself, or is it valuable because of its role as a habitat for humans and other animals? I don't think we even need to answer that question to use the fact that it is a human environment as the lens through which we should look at these crimes. I mean, in terms of whether or not creating international tribunals and laws is going to help in the short or long term, I'm both an optimist and a pessimist, and like I do believe in international law and that it could be an effective tool, but then I see its failure in Ukraine and other places, and that leads me to doubt the effectiveness of those tools. I mean, unless they're used in conjunction with actual enforcement mechanisms. But in terms of longer term justice and reparations, I mean, so I think there's some things you can never get perfect justice for. And I think what's happening in Ukraine is something that will never fully be repaired. But I think it's an additional harm not to pursue justice. So if this particular framework could be effective for understanding ways in which Ukraine has been harmed as a nation, and hopefully get some kind of reparation or rebuilding, then I think it's effective, or it could be effective. But I mean, it's very difficult to know. I mean, so we can name all these harms, and that's important, and that's a first step. But like beyond naming, there's so much more that needs to be done, and that's the really urgent thing to me. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm muted. Yes, thank you. Thank you. We already talked for 1 hour. I remind all of our participants that we are talking about war, art, and Anthropocene, and actually about anticipating uncertainty. As Alexander mentioned, this petroleum age is changing into something different, and this brings a lot of uncertainty. And some people, they embrace uncertainty with happiness, some with their faces. And now we have this phase of our discussion that our participants, they can pose questions to each other. So we have the lower bar with reactions. Please raise your hand if you have a question to each other, and then we will open this for the other people who are here if they want to ask comments. So basically, Sophia, Alexander, Asya, Michelle, I invite you kind of comments on your comments or ask questions. Okay, Sophia is first, then Michelle.
Yeah, I have a question for Michelle, more about the ways that art can influence politics. I'm not an artist, but I like art. And I guess I'm curious most of all about the relationship actually between morality and art. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I think that there's a connection there to politics too. So I guess I'm wondering whether when you create things, you think about the moral context specifically, or how you see that working together, or I guess I'm just interested in that relationship and what you think.
Michelle, you are muted, so you need to unmute yourself.
1, 2, 3, 4. Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I do consider most things a waste of time which do not have a projection into the future that is that may be positive. So as to say, it is very hard to define for yourself that what is good or bad. How can you tell? I'd say it's very hard to influence politics. I think that's impossible. I give up. Because I give you a short example. It occurred to me very, very early that the war on resources is also a war on information, because information actually will be equivalent to resources, meaning that the internet uses a lot of power, and it's always accelerating. So it would be so easy to save a lot of that power. And raising that question 20 years ago, I finally decided to do something about it. So I write a software, a package, an open source package that could compress any private website by a factor of 20. That saves 95% of energy or space. And it looks the same and it functions the same. So why wouldn't you do that? So actually announcing that to the German government to several occasions actually leads to absolutely nothing. What they do instead is making marketing campaigns that tell you that winter is maybe cold, or nonsense in my understanding. But what happens after, then politics doesn't react. But I get an offer by Andreessen Horowitz, which is a venture capital company from the US, because they make an artificial intelligence to spot me out with a chance of 1 by 200,000, like they say. So I say, well, to answer the short, I didn't go for that because I am personally too old. I would do it if I were younger. I'd gladly do it. But to say, I think I'm not going to talk to anyone anymore in politics because they have none of their own money. They invest none of their own money. They will react too slow, and I don't want me to insult anyone, but it's a waste of my time because my time is for sure limited. And the second thing is, you see that even things that are in your place where are useless, completely out of interest, maybe of complete interest to a complete other place. So that maybe doesn't even answer your question. I see the role of art in this whole setup as an instrument to come up with a language that is still not understood, and also employs the old language that had never been understood. So that actually protects you also from direct confrontation, may it be physical or mental or virtual. And I encourage everybody to go for a self-defined life as much as possible. That's easier said than done, but anything that pays you also makes you think, or makes you maybe change your mind in the long run. So I would not, in first place now, anymore lose time talking with governmental circles.
We have Asya. Just raise the hand, please, Asya.
Yes, thank you. If I can jump in, I have a comment and a little provocation as well. So I first wanted to comment on what Sophia was talking about and your question about ecocide and so on. And I think here it is important to understand, apart from kind of very obvious that humans as habitat, right, is where they live, and when it's destroyed, they cannot live there anymore. I think what is also important to understand is the fact that environment is the main, one of the main targets in the contemporary warfare. And this is what Sloterdijk argues, that this is an essential characteristic of a modern warfare, that unlike all the previous wars where it was human to human, it was the understanding that environment can be a target and therefore the enemy can be eliminated. And I think this is a very specific understanding of what happens. And he articulates it through the use of chemical weapons by Germans in the First World War, and it was the first instance. And through that, he talks about how it's not anymore a destruction of a body directly from soldier to soldier, but of an environment that eventually, through terror or pollution or all other aspects, destroys the enemy at large. So that was the comment. And the provocation, and I think it's addressed to Alexander. First of all, thank you for your book. It's really amazing, and it's really fun to read it. But I want to bring something that you addressed in the book and also in your comment when you started today, is the idea that petromodernity, or like within petromodernity, the idea that the age of fossil fuels is nearing the end. And so this is articulated in the book. And for me, because I understand, and you also mentioned that, of course, we are not yet there. But for me, the petromodernity as concept and as a book is kind of an attempt to already put this era of fossil fuels in the history. And for me, it seems rather that it's the history that saw itself in this way is coming to an end. And this also links back to my initial comment, because we see even in the current discussion around new forms of energy that are led in Europe, these new forms of energy, including hydrogen that you mentioned in the book, they are achieved through burning more fossil fuels elsewhere. So we see that it's not the end of the era. It's rather kind of a displacement of the narrative. So maybe you could comment on that. And I want to mention this really amazing scene that you describe in the book, in the chapter about pipelines and pipes, about these two, when German engineers were constructing a gas pipeline in Ukraine. And two German artists were invited to kind of do paintings of the landscape while this was constructed. And I find it amazing also how these people, these artists, they then kind of recall the moment of freedom that they had in this wild east and the steppes of Ukraine, where they could just create these paintings, and it was somewhere far away, and the freedom that they experienced. And so for me, it feels like for many, many years, for art and academia, there was so much freedom in how these other places, but then also the planet and the cosmos, how they can be theorized in certain narratives. And now this freedom is coming to an end, because suddenly those other places speak back and speak something else. So yes, so my provocation or my invitation is to talk more about, is it the end of petromodernity, or it's the end of the narrative of petromodernity? Thank you.
Well, thanks. That's a cool question. I mean, first of all, from the beginning, it was kind of a speculative concept. Of course, believed that maybe, if course of history takes another direction, then everything is completely fucked up anyway. But an increasing number of people around the globe seem to take into account that somehow a political solution to these problems has to be made. And this is why we thought, okay, we'll turn it around. And so it's not like, like this more naturalizing peak oil discourse before, which are always deemed naive. That said, that was maybe 12 years ago or something. It had its last peak, but the first peak oil discourse already was around 1900. That said, okay, until then and then, global production of petroleum will have reached its peak, and then it will decline. And we always saw new technologies and new reservoirs opened up since then. And there's still so much of fossil materialities that can be used in the earth, that this will not be a solution. So, but we thought that the political solution somehow has become unavoidable, and this is why we claimed it. But I already marked that in my introduction, that in a way we are now in a different situation, of course, with this war, or with these two wars actually. And this is, I want to put as a remark also to the different things that were said about the war in Ukraine, and especially what Sophia said. It has been a specificity of warfare during the whole 20th century, of course, to destroy environments, like you also said, Asia. And so this is really nothing new. And I think one main reason why moral majority of the democratic fighters of the West kind of hesitate to put ecocide in the international law system, of course, is because they have been committing it all the time too. And this is also an argument we make in our Ukraine article, and I think this is really important to see. There has been a war going on underneath all these wars that were all genocidal, by the way, as well. I mean, this is in no way mean to relativate what Russia is doing right now. I'm just saying, this was also a tendency throughout the 20th century to use genocide as a means of warfare, as herbicide, as ecocide. So this is, this is just more of the same, I think. Shit, I forgot my thread. Oh yeah. So in order to, there has been a war going on underneath all these wars, and this is kind of a war on nature, of course. Industrial civilization has been kind of inflicting a war on nature for almost as long as it exists, in terms of that it never thought of really, intrinsically thought about, so to say, the regenerative necessities, but basically that's resourcification. Basically did it on the premises of, we use this up and then we use the next thing up and so on, and there's enough of it. And I mean, this is what has become clearer during the last 10, 20, 30 years, but actually already since Carson's 1964 book or whatever, that this isn't true anymore. It's only one planet, and at some point this kind of dynamics has to stop. And so for me, one main moral dilemma we are in at the moment, and I think that you, Sophia, with your argumentation kind of skipped that, though I understand why, is that if we have started to try, in all different ends, so to say, and especially, of course, in the artwork, try to bring in laws of nature, whatever that means, and the voice narrations of nature as well, and trying to find out how a world and a worldview could look like that puts humans and the rest on the same level again, and not humans can use up the rest. If we have started all that, we would also have to put it into the moral discussion of a situation like the war going on in the Ukraine, and that of course could lead to results that are just unbearable at the moment. So this is why we don't do it, but at least we have started thinking about it. And this is also why it's so depressing to look at it, of course, because you have the feeling, oh, for some years we started to believe that it actually could happen, with serious nation leaders also considering Pachamama or whatever. And now, of course, it's back to realistic politics, geopolitics. And that means basically, well, we first have to win this war, and then we maybe can think about these things again. But of course, there's already another war lurking around the corner, and there's another one and another one. And the Ukraine now also started to bombard, or not bombard, but using drones, destroy, damage, sabotage Russian infrastructure, including blowing up pipelines, of course, and blowing up oil tanks. And probably from this moral position that you formulated, this is completely correct. And it's also from kind of, war rationality. It makes sense, but it's tit for tat, and it's a kind of tit for tat that we probably cannot go on doing much longer anymore. And so, it's like you wish for some godlike, whatever, outside position that really like says, no, come on, stop it, all of you. And it's not there, of course, and that's a problem. So I'm closing very shortly to come back to your interesting question, whether, I mean, when this term Anthropocene came up, I was immediately excited because I thought, great, now we can talk about ecology again, because it wasn't possible for 20 years before that, or 15 years. And we don't have to use the term ecology, and we don't have to use the term sustainability. But at the same time, I thought it's a bit like some Hegelian term, it comes up, it is there to be, so to say, swallowed up by the development that has started. And with petromodernity, it's a bit the opposite. It's like, of course, we are facing post-petromodernity. It's very clear that on many different levels, this time will stay, and it's also desirable in some instances. But then you're right, maybe this kind of historiography, which is still committed to progress thinking in progress terms and industrial civilization development terms, also has to come to an end, and then it would be, so to say, taken away by itself. But I think this will take very long, because the afterlives, there are too many afterlives. And especially, of course, if we talk about the nuclear age, but this is also one very short comment to Michel and all this nuclear age thing. I think that's just the spectacular side of the time we are living in, but the far more dangerous side are the unspectacular, so to say, common everyday things on the molecular level, all those chemistries, all chemicals, all of the success of the economic systems, the continuous production and using up and leakages and so on. And then they are topped by wars.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexander, for this, mentioning also that, us Ukrainians, we also destroy a lot of things now during the war. I can also confess that I shared these emotional feelings, as many of my colleagues, who would say, if Ukraine is doomed to die and be destroyed, then we will take down also our neighbor, and we will destroy them as well. As you say, it's really, I mean, ethically it's explainable, but then according to everything we say about nature, environment, it's suicidal thinking. So we need to stop, but we don't know how to stop. Sophia, please.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of Alexander's points. The first kind of goes back to something he was saying a bit earlier. I don't actually think all of the wars of the 20th century were genocidal, and I think it's actually really important that we hold apart genocidal war where there's a direct intent by the perpetrator to destroy a people, and wars that are just very destructive that maybe have the effect of destroying a people in whole or in part. And I think that, yeah, so I think there's like a morally relevant distinction there. But it's important to, I'm not saying there were no genocidal wars in the 20th century. Obviously there were, obviously, but I just don't, I would be reluctant to class wars as genocidal merely because of the level of destruction brought during them. And I would also say sort of just like when you see ecocide as part of a war, or when you see wars that target the environment, that doesn't inherently make them genocidal. That has to be coupled with intent. That's like the key part of genocide. So a war can look like exactly the same, like two wars can look identical in terms of destruction and actions, but one can be genocidal and the other might not be if there's no intention behind it. And that's like, in moral philosophy, intention is like this very important concept that kind of colors the moral like timbre of all different actions. So that's, I mean, that's my view. I understand that people might disagree, but I wanted to voice that. And then in terms of sort of the question you were raising of saying, well, you know, like obviously what Russia's doing in Ukraine is horrible and ecocide. They're destroying everything. Like Ukrainians, you know, are also destroying certain things in Russia. And like, how long can we allow this to go? And sort of like, what's the implication of that? And I think when we look at the ethics of war and when we look through that kind of lens, sorry, I want to go back a little bit. I think in that framing, the environment is sort of like a moral entity, sort of on a par with different peoples. And this is sort of what I was trying to gesture out earlier with my response to Bogdan's question. I don't really think we should be anthropomorphizing the environment, because then we might go into situations where we're prioritizing environmental concerns over like the concerns of people. So for me, I guess, like, I don't think this is the argument you were trying to make necessarily, but I could see one using some of your claims to make such an argument, like, oh, you know, we can't have this kind of environmental degradation. What Ukrainians and Russians are doing to the environment is morally on a par or morally equivalent because it has equivalent effects on the environment. Thus, we should prioritize whatever solution causes the degradation to stop most quickly rather than most justly. And I think, you know, something where you just stopped the fighting along whatever territorial lines are currently staked out condemns all of the people living under Russian occupation. And in fact, all the people, I mean, yeah, all the people living under Russian occupation to living under a genocidal regime. And so, like, to me, the environment is a thing that can be rebuilt and regrown, but like people can't be in that way. So I guess I would just be like careful about weighing those kinds of considerations against one another, because like I don't see them as being on a par. But maybe I'm not reading what you were saying correctly, so definitely correct me if I'm wrong.
This Alexander.
Just a short repetition to what you were saying about anthropomorphizing. I actually wanted to say that earlier. I think that's a very easy argument because people have been aware in both theory and especially also literature and art for quite a while that this is a trap and a danger. And there are many ways of addressing the problem now have been developed during the last 10-15 years or whatever, that convincingly avoid to anthropomorphize. You know, I mean, that's not any trial to attach laws to anything or rights necessitates that it has, for example, a voice or self-recognition or whatever. That would be self-anthropomorphizing, and it can, you know, it can work differently. I just want to say, because I think that it's a very typical argument from a certain philosophical school to avoid, to avoid all those notions of trying to put nature on a level. And I think what you said about nature, biotopes can be regenerated, people cannot. I mean, that's kind of naive, isn't it? I mean, we know that some of those biotopes, of course, cannot be regenerated, and that or only in, you know, in terms that are far beyond even human evolutionary terms, but definitely historical terms. So it will take thousands of years that they maybe tip again to another level, or it may take 10,000s, 100,000s of years. So we are, you know, we are tapping into nature historical terms, time scales here, and that's of course, you know, in these times, hundred civilizations can, you know, rise and fall again. And population can go up to 10 billion and then dwindle down again to 800 million or whatever, or only 100 million or whatever, you know. So, no, I mean, if we want to take that into account and put it into our ethics, then we also have to acknowledge that we are dealing with very different timescales there. And it's not like, yeah, I mean, humans have, you know, produced wars during all the time, you know, and have proved that their, you know, next generation is able to recover. They are very fast in recovering. Rivers are faster, but woods are slower already. And soil needs 100 years.
Okay, I like that we have real discussion. So Sophia, then Asya.
I will be relatively brief. I don't think my comment was naive. I don't think it's easy to rebuild the environment. I certainly acknowledge all of your points about the duration of time. But again, I don't think it's appropriate to weigh inanimate objects against human lives. And maybe reading your comments more charitably, if we care about the environment as a host for human lives, I still think we need to fight for human rights and the right systems of governance, because what is the point of a hospitable environment that hosts authoritarianism and terror? Like, I don't, there, you know, there are different ways humanity can survive, and humans persisting in a way that's unfree, it is less important to me than a pristine environment. And then I'd also just say, in terms of the timescale comment, like, I believe that we have stronger moral duties to those who we exist closer to, both in space and in time. And so I do believe we have moral obligations to future generations, but I think we have stronger moral obligations to both our own people and people who will exist immediately after us. So we owe it to them to give them the tools, and also just like a world in which they can continue to be custodians of the future. You know, I think we all, like, each generation hands the reins over to the next, and we can't be prioritizing the needs of people 1,000 years in the future over people 50 years in the future.
Asya, please.
Thank you. No, I also want to say that I don't find Sophia's points naive, and actually far too often I've encountered situations where it was exactly like this. But don't you understand that there is this bigger problem that affects, that are in the long term And it's more important that that small problem that is regional, such as war in specific places. And I think for me, the problem is because logically, this is a fair point, right? But then what does this mean? How does it first, I think there is an asymmetry that needs to be seen even when we speculate about it. Because to be able to think about the long history of the planet, it's a like we have this time and space to sit and think about it. What is the, you know, like we have enough safety to think about it and to think what is more important. And then in this logic, we kind of, because this is more important, we can sacrifice those other places, right? Where people are actually threatened as we speak. They don't have a privilege. And it's not because they're not smart, they don't think about environment, but it's because their immediate task is to survive. And I think the awareness of from which position we speak when we think about what needs to be sacrificed and why those places of sacrifice are always elsewhere, and not only they're elsewhere, they are feeding these places in so many ways, like through resources, energies, through withholding all the or sustaining all the terror there and not allowing it to come here. So I think this is I think this discussion somehow always comes up, right? And it's a very important kind of the ethical question in the sense that like how human rights on one hand and then the thinking about nature on the other one. It's very often that I see this kind of clash, but I also we cannot, I don't think we can just kind of sacrifice, or like what is this, where is this proposition of sacrificing some people's, because overall people are too many. Like for me this is also problematic.
Alexander, and then after your, or you this was just by accident, the raised hand.
No, it was on purpose. You know, of course, I don't want to prioritize one over the other, and I was pointing to the moral dilemma more or less. But you know, one thing I think is important to see also, because we have this art in the title. What are we talking about? I mean, we are not politics advisors, and I mean, at least in Germany, for example, in Germany, the majority of politics was quite clear about this war, and quite soon. And ich bin hier, nein, das geht jetzt nicht.
Human agents, but on other side of.
Sorry. So the question is, who is trying out these new, so to say, new argumentations, and who is going into these dilemmas, and who is doing it, really facing the brutal truth? And I guess this is necessary. I mean, of course, it's extremely dangerous, and you can easily take yourself out of any, so to say, morally legitimated discourse very easily. But still, you know, if it stays on one side and there's all this nice new eco literature and climate fiction and so on, and then on the other side, there's, so to say, the brutal reality of necessary wars and it's always like real politics that's going on. And in these situations, you would always have those argumentations by politicians and their experts saying it's it's necessary. It's just without a different possibility. And okay, I think I said what I wanted to say. It's kind of difficult.
So Thank you for fruitful conversation. I invite also our listeners to pose the question or give comments. Especially, I invite Taras Nazaruk or Kim, Brian or Taras. Would you like to say something? You have still a few minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Bogdan. Actually, I have some comments and questions in mind. Thank you. First of all, thank you for this very thought-provoking discussion. Yeah, I have a question that maybe goes in a bit a different direction. But before I do that, maybe I'll also have some comment on the very recent discussion about this prioritizing, I know, social and political injustice over the climate crisis, or prioritizing climate crisis over some other issues that are on the agenda. I think that maybe bringing another concept that I've been thinking a lot, and it is also quite often discussed in the literature, it might be potentially useful, which is climate justice. So basically, the concept that allows you to think about climate crisis and finding solutions to the climate crisis without prioritizing it over social injustice, political injustice, and other issues that are quite relevant to different societies worldwide. So maybe this notion of climate justice is another concept that could be discussed. But my overall or my initial original question to the participants was about something else, because we touched many concepts and metaphors, and I want to bring another one that was partially touched upon in one of the comments earlier about AI, and I also wanted to bring this up here and maybe ask participants to elaborate on that more, because the comment that was made is about Trump saying that perhaps we might need another Manhattan Project on the AI is because of the, I don't know, as far as I understand, this is also part of the how AI affects the imaginary also, that it becomes so threatening that there's this fear over the AI, so that we need some Manhattan projects or something similar to nuclear bomb project in order to somehow handle the risks or the potential risk or imaginary over the risks of the artificial intelligence that is in the society. So there is probably something even kind of unheimlich about the AI, something uncanny, scary, or threatening. It's almost as threatening and fearful as a nuclear weapon, right? It's kind of, at least this is the signs of what I hear from this quote from Trump, that there is this fear over the AI. And when it comes to AI in the context of Russian war in Ukraine, or in the context of discussion about the Anthropocene, and I can see it in practice. So, for instance, in Ukraine, in case of using AI, we can see a lot on the discourse level how it is being used in terms of developing different kind of fakes, propaganda messages, and disseminating it to this kind of overall public discussion. At the same time, it is being used, I mean, Ukraine, and again, this is about resourcification. We can see how the front line in Ukraine is used by different big tech companies in order, as a testing ground, to test certain weapons or certain devices or certain algorithmic technologies based on AI on the battlefield. So, for instance, there's this big tech company, Palantir, or some other, that they quite openly say that this is the big moment for them, because they can use their certain developments, they can test it. And Ukraine, in this case, and the war in Ukraine becomes a testing ground for this kind of tools. So we see that in the practice, on this kind of examples of using AI in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. But what about imaginary? And this is what I wanted to ask about. Whether do we see that Russia's war in Ukraine somehow affects our, I mean, globally or in specific societies, our imaginary, is it about the AI? But does this war somehow affect our understanding, our imaginary on the artificial intelligence, or potentially produce something else? Do we really see that it becomes something more threatening than, for instance, nuclear weapons? And whether the context of Russia's war in Ukraine has a certain effect on that?
Thank you, Taras. We have Michelle who wants to answer, and I remind you kindly that we have a few more minutes to end up our conversation. So those who want to answer, please raise your hands.
Thank you, Taras, for the question. To answer it would be, I think it's impossible. I see a strong connection again between radiation and the nuclear and machines. As you remember, the machines sent by Siemens, for example, to Chernobyl did not function because they could not control them, because the radiation is so strong it makes them uncontrollable. Same in Fukushima. They had to have a technical naval string to put these cameras inside the reactor. But now machines or artificial intelligence can actually improve a lot on that. And I think in this situation of war, also in the situation, civil situation of Sellafield. Sellafield in England, for example, is the probably one of the most contaminated places in the near universe. Humans by themselves cannot go in there anymore. It has to be machine. So the machine has to learn, understand how to deal with it, and which introduces now a possibility that whatever is nuclear is just poisonous for us, but in the future may be a potential for energy harvesting. Just like we try to use solar panels, in the future, it's probably possible to use nuclear panels or whatever. So I think this testing, I'm sorry to say testing ground in this whole discussion, but that's the same like nuclear testing warheads. Like in this testing ground, I think you can largely train and optimize all your artificial intelligence, because the digital age also mostly had been taking place in oil companies and the military. Don't forget that. I mean, always what we get is just maybe a social media app or something. For instance, I remember that talking about high performance computers in the 90s or early 2000s, like 80 or 90% of them were used for oil companies for mining. And what's happening now is again related to energy. I think to announce a Manhattan project for artificial intelligence is really scary, because that's clearly a Manhattan project has been a military project in the first place. And that's honest. That has been an honest announcement, I think, but that is really scary, because artificial intelligence right now also, or at least the ones I can access, even if they're free and uncensored, it is so censored already, or so impossible to have an unbiased artificial intelligence, that it's not really interesting to actually not talk with an intelligence, but with, let's say, a narrated, guarded system that has human overimposed limits on it. And I think these situations that are out of control, like war, crisis, or exclusion zones, are very welcome for anybody working in the field. Just to say, I find it interesting that Palantir just recently also has invested into art. They've made large art exhibitions or funded them in Germany, just as a side note.
Thank you, Michelle. So the last comment is coming from Sophia. Please go ahead.
I'll be pretty brief. So just going back to Taras's question about what the use of AI in Ukraine right now shows us about what, like, the level of threat AI poses in general, and comparing it to nuclear weapons. Or I'll just say nuclear technology in general, because I actually think both AI and nuclear technology have both positive and negative uses. You know, like nuclear energy is quite powerful and could be used well, potentially. I know that's a debate, but and nuclear weapons also arguably debate. I'm not coming down on any side of this, but like can promote peace, in the sense that they disincentivize great powers from fighting with each other. And so with AI, we see the same thing. And I guess, you know, there's two ways AI might be a threat. One might be in the way that humans use it, and the other is if it fully developed consciousness. We're not there yet, so I'm going to leave that aside. So like right now, what we're looking at is just very, very powerful machine learning, which, if it can be used to win a war quickly or efficiently by the right side, would be great. But if it's used to disseminate information and disseminate disinformation, that's a big thing. So I think both of these technologies, and we can see this in like through the example of Ukraine, it's basically like the threat is humans. The threat is how we use it. It's hard to know what to do with that information, but and I don't think we should stop developing technologies because of it. But yeah, so I guess I don't necessarily think there's like a clear answer. There's nothing inherent in most technologies that makes them bad or good.
Yeah, I also agree that technologies, of course, they are not neutral, but nothing bad or good in them. Our human capability to make something bad or good normally relate to us. This is the end of our very interesting and fruitful conversation. I'm not sure whether Taras or Kim, Brian want to end up this session with some statements.
Perhaps I can just thank you all once again for this very interesting and thought-provoking discussion, for bringing us so many questions and issues to discuss. I also want to thank our audience for being with us, and also my fellow co-organizer Kim, Brian Dudek, and Pohang Biennale in general for initiating and organizing this event. And I also want to say hello for the future viewers of the recording of this conversation in Pohang Biennale. Thank you for watching this. Thank you for being with us, and I hope it was interesting and productive for you as well, as much as it was for us. So thank you again to all of you, and yeah, have a good evening, and have a good day in the US. Bye bye.
Bye bye.